They were trained to believe America was weak, decadent, collapsing. But on a warm Texas night in 1943, captured German soldiers stepped off a train and saw something that shattered everything they had been taught. Endless electric light, overflowing food, and an enemy so rich it didn't bother to hide its power. This wasn't a prison camp. It was the moment Nazi ideology began to die. June 11, 1943. Main Street, Sweetwater, Texas. Gefreiter Karl-Heinz Vogel paused before closing the small notebook he kept hidden inside his issued jacket. Writing in it was forbidden, dangerous, but what he had just seen demanded to be recorded, even if the price was punishment. "Something is wrong," he wrote. "This country cannot be real." From the narrow window of the troop train, Vogel watched light spill endlessly across the prairie. Not a single house darkened, not a single street dimmed. Gas stations, cafes, grain silos, even isolated farmhouses burned with electric light long after sunset. It was nearly 10 at night, and the land glowed as if the war did not exist. In Germany, blackout orders had smothered cities since 1940. Villages vanished into darkness after dusk. Even before the war, fewer than 1 in 4 rural farms had electricity. And yet here in what Nazi broadcasts described as a soft, decadent nation, power flowed without restraint. The train slowed. More than 1,700 prisoners from the former Africa Corps stepped onto the platform. They were not unloaded from freight wagons. There were no guards shouting, no rifle butts, no barbed wire funnels. They disembarked from Pullman passenger coaches, complete with upholstered seats, sleeping compartments, and a dining car. The people of Sweetwater had gathered quietly along the tracks. Farmers, shopkeepers, children. They watched not with hatred, but with curiosity. What none of the German soldiers understood that night was that they had already lost something more important than the war. They had lost the lie. Only weeks earlier, on May 12, 1943, the Axis position in North Africa had collapsed completely. General Wilhelm Ritter, commanding what remained of German forces after Rommel's departure, surrendered alongside approximately 260,000 German and Italian troops in Tunisia. The final count would remain uncertain for days as isolated units laid down their arms. Among the captured was Hauptmann Otto Weissmann, a decorated officer, veteran of Poland, France, and the desert campaigns. He had survived British encirclement twice, been wounded once, and carried the Iron Cross First Class. Years later, Weissmann's diary, preserved in a Midwestern University archive, would become one of the clearest records of what captivity in America did to the German soldier's mind. The transformation did not begin in Texas. It began weeks earlier on the North African coast. At Bone, Algeria, tens of thousands of prisoners were gathered into temporary holding camps while transport was organized. Conditions were crowded, dusty, and uncomfortable, but orderly. The Americans processed men at a pace the Wehrmacht itself had never achieved. Names recorded, photographs taken, medical checks performed, vaccinations administered. Most unsettling of all, their rights under the Geneva Convention were explained clearly, in fluent German, by U.S. officers trained specifically for prisoner handling. Then came the food. Obergefreiter Ernst Keller, formerly of the 15th Panzer Division, wrote months later to his sister, "We expected hunger. Instead, we received white bread every day, coffee that tasted real, meat regularly, more than we had seen in half a year in Africa." At first, many believed it was a performance, an act meant to soften them for propaganda. They did not yet understand that this was simply normal. When the prisoners were marched aboard transport ships, the illusion finally shattered. The vessels waiting in port were not aging freighters or converted liners. They were new, fresh steel, clean decks, engines humming with effortless power. The truth revealed itself quietly, not through interrogation, not through lectures, but through overheard conversations. The engines the prisoners learned from casually talkative American sailors were not produced in one place at all. Their ship's power plant came from 3 separate industrial regions, each manufacturing standardized sections, cylinders, turbines, generators, then shipped by rail to coastal yards that, astonishingly, had not existed before 1941. Entire ports, built from empty shoreline. Major Friedrich Albrecht von Hardenberg, descended from a Prussian officer family that traced its service back to the 7 Years' War, noted the detail in a small notebook he later carried home. "As we approached the coast," he wrote years afterward, "I observed the rotating radar assembly mounted openly above the bridge. This device, which we believed to be rare even among our own forces, appeared here as routine equipment on a merchant vessel." It was at that moment, Hardenberg admitted, that the thought first occurred to him: unwelcome and irreversible. Germany cannot win this war. August 6, 1943, Hampton Roads, Virginia. The American coastline did not greet them with ceremony. It greeted them with scale. The naval complex stretched farther than the eye could follow. Dry docks, piers, cranes, warehouses, rails, roads, all operating simultaneously. Ships entered and departed without pause. There was no visible urgency, no chaos, only rhythm. Gefreiter Paul Schneider, formerly a machinist from Essen, stood silently on deck counting vessels. He reached 53 before losing track. In a note later recovered by historians, he wrote, "Each crane lifted loads that would have required an entire shift of men at home. Here, a single operator moved them with ease. No steam, no coal smoke, only electricity." The prisoners were marched inland past rows of parked automobiles, hundreds of them, belonging not to officers, but to dock laborers. In Germany, a private car remained a rarity. The promised people's vehicle existed mostly in posters and speeches. Here, men drove to manual labor in machines they owned themselves. The comparison was unavoidable. Then came the trains. The Germans prepared themselves for freight wagons, for straw, for standing room. Instead, waiting on the platform were long-distance passenger coaches, polished, enclosed, climate-controlled. Soft seats folded into sleeping berths. Dining cars gleamed with linen and metal cutlery. Captain Ernst Faulkner, captured near Tunis, wrote later, "We boarded without shouting, without blows. One American guard even apologized that the cooling system in our car was under repair. Cooling. In summer, such comfort," Faulkner noted bitterly, "had existed only for the highest party leadership back home. The journey south would take 3 days, and with every mile, belief collapsed further. The trains rolled through Virginia, then North Carolina, town after town, glowing against the night. Shop windows lit, streets illuminated, houses bright in multiple rooms, places that in Germany would have gone dark after sunset burned with casual abundance. Factories operated through the night. Their windows shone. Their yards were filled with vehicles even at midnight. Unteroffizier Leo Brandt, whose father held a minor party post in Bremen, wrote later, "Every small town had more light than our entire district. The guards said this had been normal for decades. I laughed at first, then I stopped laughing. At Bluefield, West Virginia, the train halted briefly for servicing. What followed disturbed many more deeply than the lights. American rail crews completed in 20 minutes tasks that required over an hour in Europe. Automated coal systems, electric pumps, mechanized inspection platforms, all without raised voices. As the train carried them deeper inland, denial became impossible. Through the wide windows, the prisoners observed industrial landscapes without end, factories so vast that even veteran engineers struggled to comprehend their scale. Along the Tennessee River, the convoy slowed near a massive aluminum complex operated by a company the guards casually called Alcoa. The facility extended for miles, its smelters glowing day and night, fed by hydroelectric dams that supplied more power than several major European cities combined. Unteroffizier Max Breuer, once an apprentice metalworker in Düsseldorf, whispered to the man beside him, "This is not a factory. This is a continent turned into a machine." Near southern Indiana, Fields that should have held corn instead bristled with steel towers and distillation columns. Entire synthetic rubber plants had risen where, 2 years earlier, there had been nothing but soil. 4 installations operated side by side, each staffed by thousands, producing more artificial rubber annually than Germany had managed throughout the entire war. Oberleutnant Hans Richter, formerly a chemical analyst connected to pre-war industrial research, understood at once what this meant. "We created the process," he would later explain. "They perfected the system and multiplied it." Outside Detroit, the train passed a structure so immense it seemed unreal. An aircraft factory stretched to the horizon. Endless glass, steel, and concrete. Assembly lines ran with mechanical precision. Completed bombers rolled forward while unfinished ones followed behind in an unbroken stream. This was Willow Run, a single plant producing heavy bombers at a pace that defied belief. Hauptmann Lothar Meissner, a former Luftwaffe pilot captured after his aircraft was destroyed over Tunisia, stood silently as the factory slid past the windows. He counted aircraft, then stopped counting. "They told us these planes were crude," he later wrote. "But nothing crude can be built with this level of coordination. This was elegance. Industrial elegance. What Germany constructed with skill, America produced with rhythm." At St. Louis, the train crossed the Mississippi River. Below, barges moved slowly through brown water, stacked deep with grain. Not crates, not sacks, entire floating mountains of wheat. Elevators lined the riverbanks, vast concrete towers capable of storing harvests beyond European comprehension. Unteroffizier Georg Lehmann, raised on a small farm in Württemberg, recorded quietly, "They transport food the way we transport artillery shells, in volume so large that loss does not matter." As they passed one loading platform, Lehmann observed a dock worker eating lunch, thick slices of meat between white bread, eaten casually without ceremony. "That sandwich," he noted, "contained more meat than my family saw in a month." Further west, near Kansas City, the train halted briefly beside enormous stockyards. The air itself carried the smell of slaughter. Tens of thousands of cattle waited in orderly pens. Packing plants operated without pause, their output feeding a nation and much of the Allied war effort. Gefreiter Walter Hennig, who had survived months on reduced rations in North Africa, watched American workers eat beef during their break. "They consumed meat as a habit," he wrote later, "not as a luxury, as routine." A guard, noticing their stares, purchased sandwiches from a nearby stand. Hamburgers, cheese, vegetables. He handed them out without comment, paid with coins. It was not charity. It was normal. The camps themselves delivered the final blow. Camp Dawson, Texas, constructed in a matter of months, housed thousands of prisoners in conditions superior to those many had known as civilians. Wooden barracks with electric lighting. Each morning trucks rolled out of the camps. There were no covered windows, no detours, no attempts at concealment. German prisoners traveled openly through the American interior, seeing the country exactly as it was meant to be seen. Endless fields, highways thick with traffic, factories operating day and night, shops overflowing with goods, homes glowing with electric light, radios humming in living rooms, refrigerators cooling food without ice. Nothing was hidden. At a cotton processing facility outside Brazoria County, Texas, Unteroffizier Rudolf Koenig watched a single electrically driven gin separate, clean, and bale cotton at a speed he found impossible to accept. In 1 hour, the machine handled what would have occupied his entire hometown for weeks using manual labor. The power came from a regional hydroelectric network tied to the Lower Colorado River Project, part of a nationwide rural electrification effort. By 1943, electricity had reached nearly every farm in the region. The owner, Koenig recorded, was not noble, not political, not important, just a farmer. Yet that farmer possessed electric power, plumbing, 2 vehicles, and modern machinery. His workers, black and white alike, 8 lunches packed with bread, meat, fruit, and sweets. This was not exceptional, Koenig noted. It was routine. Further north, in western Nebraska, POWs were assigned to sugar beet harvests. Here, disbelief turned into silence. Mechanized harvesters rolled across fields so vast they disappeared into the horizon. One machine, the prisoners learned, replaced the labor of an entire company of men. Gefreiter Otto Reinhardt, raised on a small holding in Saxony, struggled to process what he saw. "The land here is not farmed," he wrote. "It is engineered." Farmers discussed yields casually, numbers that in Germany would have been cited in academic journals rather than everyday conversation. Outside North Platte, Reinhardt worked alongside a farmer's teenage son operating a tractor worth more than everything Reinhardt's father had owned. When he commented on it, the boy laughed. "This one's old," the boy said. "Dad's waiting on a better model." The most unsettling experiences came from work assignments near American industry. While the Geneva Convention barred POWs from direct weapons production, prisoners were employed in civilian sectors that freed American labor for the war effort. The distinction was legal and transformative. At a food processing plant in Pennsylvania, prisoners observed production lines that turned raw vegetables into canned goods at astonishing speed. Conveyor belts never stopped. Machines filled, sealed, cooked, and labeled thousands of units per hour. Stabs Unteroffizier Karl Dietrich, formerly employed in a German food plant, documented the scene carefully. One elderly woman supervised an entire line. What required dozens of men at home was here controlled by dials and switches. She worked calmly, listened to the radio, drank coffee. Production exceeded pre-war levels despite most able-bodied men serving overseas. Near Dearborn, Michigan, POW labor details unloading coal at power stations caught distant glimpses of industrial giants. Across the River Rouge complex stretched endlessly. Steel, glass, smoke, motion. The guards explained that tens of thousands worked there, producing engines, vehicles, and armor simultaneously. Obergefreiter Martin Köhler wrote, "We saw the parking areas first, endless rows of cars. The guards said they belonged to workers." Workers. In Germany, even officers rarely owned automobiles. Here, laborers drove themselves to work. Some, the guards added casually, owned more than one. No one laughed at that claim anymore. By late 1943, American intelligence officers noted a shift. The prisoners were changing. Oberleutnant Martin Schaefer, whose younger brother had been killed during the firestorm over Hamburg, wrote quietly in the margin of a letter he never sent. "They know who we are. They know what our armies have done. Many of these men have sons fighting us right now. Yet they treat us with restraint, with dignity, and with a kindness that cannot be explained as propaganda." Schaefer paused, then added the sentence that would define the experience of an entire generation. "Only a nation utterly certain of victory behaves this way." The Christmas of 1943 marked the final fracture. The meal served to German prisoners was not symbolic. It was not theatrical. It was ordinary. Turkey, ham, potatoes, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Food in quantities unseen in Germany since before the collapse of the Kaiserreich. Men ate until they were physically ill, not from hunger, but from disbelief. Feldwebel Arnold Becker wrote, "We ate better than generals, better than party officials. The guards told us this was how American families ate at home." He underlined the last sentence twice. "If prisoners are fed this way," he asked, "what must their soldiers receive?" In early 1944, the transformation became institutional. Tens of thousands of prisoners enrolled in education programs. English classes filled immediately. Mathematics, engineering, economics, and history followed. American universities participated openly. Correspondence courses arrived from Midwestern institutions. Visiting lecturers spoke on constitutional government, labor organization, and scientific research. Prisoners who had been taught that America was intellectually barren encountered libraries larger than anything outside Berlin. They read newspapers freely. Multiple newspapers, each contradicting the others. Truth, they discovered, was not enforced. It was debated. Hauptmann Dr. Ernst Adler, a physicist mobilized from pre-war research work, attended advanced science lectures at a southern camp. Jewish professors taught us, he later wrote. Men our system had driven into exile. They showed no bitterness. They treated knowledge as something that belonged to humanity, not to nations. American research, Adler noted, was years ahead, and it was shared. The camp screened films, not ideological instruction, entertainment, Hollywood productions. Prisoners watched stories of American hardship, corruption, failure, and recovery, shown openly, without censorship. Lieutenant Friedrich Sommer wrote, "They show their weaknesses to enemies. In Germany, this would be treason. Here, it is confidence." That honesty disturbed many more than any lecture could have. By spring 1944, prisoner labor programs expanded further as American production reached historic levels. German POWs worked in mills, warehouses, and processing plants, never directly in weapons assembly, but close enough to understand the scale. In Louisiana, they unloaded steel destined for amphibious landing craft. They watched assembly lines turn raw material into finished vessels with relentless speed. Stabsfeld-Weibel Otto Lehmann recorded, "Women welded hulls, teenagers operated heavy drills, black workers managed cranes. Everything we were told could not function in a democracy functioned flawlessly. 3 shifts, day and night, no pause. At a steel complex in the Ohio Valley, furnaces ran continuously, fed by ore from the north and coal from the east." Obergefreiter Karl Voss, once employed in the Ruhr, stood silent before the blast furnaces. "I believed I understood industry," he wrote. "I did not." He noted that workers complained about fatigue while producing quantities Germany could not achieve, even with forced labor. "They waste what we die for." By the summer of 1944, American intelligence assessments used a new phrase,